From the United Nations headquarters in New York, this is Disarmament Today.
This is Ben Basley-Walker of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. We're talking to Theresa Hitchens. Theresa Hitchens is currently the Director of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Prior to being Director of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, Theresa was Director of the Center for Defense Information in Washington, where she worked on a variety of international security issues, including running Center for Defense Information Space Security. Theresa has worked on defense and security issues as a policy analyst and now as an employee of the United Nations. The United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research is a voluntary-funded autonomous institution within the United Nations. An impartial actor, the Institute generates ideas and promotes action on disarmament and security. And today we are going to be talking about space security. Theresa, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. So, Theresa, space is one of those things that everybody's heard of, everybody's seen a sci-fi movie. So why does space matter in everyday life of your average citizen today?
You're right. When people think about space, they often think about the Hubble telescope or they think about Star Wars, one or the other. But space is much more than that. Space is actually a part of everyone's lives every day. You touch space every single day. When you turn on your computer and open up your internet browser, when you walk out of the house and you go to the ATM machine, when you look up at the big screen TV on your office wall, you're often touching a satellite because telecommunications and broadcasting goes through satellites. Much of the internet traffic is bounced off satellites. Space has become a very important part of global economic, cultural life. It's used for many other things as well, such as weather prediction, GPS, mapping, and it's also used by the militaries in planning and in communicating in peacetime, but also in wartime. So it's a vital asset to a number of different segments of society. Over the last 10, 20 years, there's been a real change in the nature of how space has been used, in the importance of space. In particular, if you think about the beginning of the space age 50 years ago, only the two superpowers were engaged in space, the United States and the then Soviet Union, and they engaged in the famous space race. And the space race was, in some ways, about military competition between the two superpowers, but it was also about a competition for prestige. Things have changed a lot since those days. There are now something like 60 countries operating in space. There are more than 1,000 operating satellites and some 20,000 pieces of junk that we can identify on orbit, which we'll talk about perhaps junk a little bit later because it's an important problem. So the environment is completely different. The key thing that has happened in this 20-year time span that I've been talking about is that space also became very, very important in a different way to military operations. When you had just Soviet Union and the United States, you had a strategic competition. Space was used for strategic things. It was used primarily for spying on each other and keeping tabs on each other's nuclear forces, so for verification of nuclear activities. Starting in about 1990, militaries figured out that they could use satellites for other things. This was the development of the GPS satellites, which I mentioned earlier. GPS satellites were developed by the U.S. military in order to provide precision targeting capabilities. So in other words, new types of missiles that could be more precisely aimed, as well as other things. But that was a key function of those satellites. Satellites became more and more important to transferring information about the battlefield. So maps, images, logistical type of information. In the 1990s, people were talking about something called the revolution in military affairs, and that was primarily based on the use of satellite assets in order to provide a battlefield edge. This has raised issues with regard to military competition and the potential for warfare involving satellites. If you have an asset, any kind of asset, military asset, that's very, very important to getting a cutting edge in a conflict or gaining the cutting edge in a conflict, that asset is likely to be seen as a target by your potential opponents. At the same time, satellites on orbit are extremely vulnerable things. They move in predictable orbits, and they're very fragile, which is also a problem because that makes them an interesting target. Not just a target because they're used, but an interesting target because they're also vulnerable and something that can be attacked. So this has led to concerns about the potential for space warfare. And that potential is out there. 3 countries have tested weapons against satellites, so-called anti-satellite weapons. The former Soviet Union, now Russia, the United States, and China most recently in 2009.
So let's talk a little bit more about space weapons. What exactly does a space weapon look like? Everybody's seen Star Wars, but I'm assuming that's not exactly what you're talking about. We're hardly making Death Stars. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of explanations of what kind of types of weapons are there and whether weapons that we know in a traditional, conventional context are being applied to space.
That's actually a really good question, and no one is building a Death Star that I know of. The technology is much more mundane, sadly, than most of the sci-fi books that you read. At the same time, being much more mundane means it's actually much more achievable. So the basic there are several different kinds of weapons that could be used in a space context. When you say space weapons, it's kind of a misnomer in a way for different types of weaponry. The first type, and the type that's been around the longest, would be ground-based or terrestrial-based anti-satellite weapons. So these are missiles based on the ground or based on a boat or based on a plane that are used to strike down satellites closer to the Earth. So satellites closer to the Earth are said to be in low Earth orbit. And satellites in low Earth orbit are used to take pictures on the ground, primarily. They're used for other things, but they're the spy satellites. They're the ones that map. They're Google Earth, okay? And those types of weapons have been around as long as satellites because they're based on ballistic missile technology. And so that's essentially what you use to launch a satellite into orbit can be used to launch a missile into your satellite. 3 countries have tested ASAT weapons, the U.S., the former Soviet Union, now Russia, and China was most recent.
We've heard of several concepts. How it's been explained to me is you have weapons, as you said, that go from the Earth into space to hit a satellite, which I hear is quite hard. Then you have weapons which are space-to-space, attacking assets on orbit, which, again, sounds all a little bit sci-fi. And then there's a third category of space weapons which go from space to the ground. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I was intending to do that. You are correct. There are 3 types of potential space weapons. I don't want to say there are 3 types of space weapons because some things just do not exist at this moment. But there are 3 types of potential. The one that I mentioned, which are from ground, you're very correct, from the Earth, essentially, to space, to destroy a satellite. That's the ASAT type. The second type is something that would be based in space and used to hit another satellite in space or to somehow disrupt or destroy another satellite in space. There are different possibilities for that technology. In reality, another satellite could be a weapon. If you moved your satellite, which was close to somebody else's satellite, and hit somebody else's satellite, that would be using your satellite as a weapon. Now, you would have no real reason to do that, given that most satellites cost upwards of $3 billion to put in space. So you probably aren't going to use your own satellite to do it. But technically, in theory, of course, this could be done. So specialized small satellites could be built that could move in orbit and run into another satellite. And another way of harming a satellite in space would be to put into space a satellite, a small satellite that has, for example, radio frequency jammers on it or high-powered microwaves, which could destroy or fry the electronics on a target satellite. There have been some discussions of putting lasers in space, space-based lasers. That's pretty much science science fiction. Right now, we don't have the technology. It's going to be a long way to be able to do this. We can't even really put lasers in the air because the chemicals that are required to make the laser are too heavy. You can't do it. So it's really not feasible. Of course, there's always nuclear weapons, and potentially someone could blow a nuke up in space and cause electromagnetic pulse, which would again sort of fry the electronics on a satellite. It is against the Outer Space Treaty to use weapons of mass destruction in space or to station them on celestial bodies. So that particular brand of conflict in space, nuclear conflict in space, has actually been outlawed by international law. Of course, I guess that doesn't always mean that everyone would comply with it. But if you used a nuclear weapon in space, it would not only take out your enemy's satellites, but it would be quite likely to take out your own. So again, the drivers to doing that would have to be pretty extreme. It's not something that it's not something I lie awake thinking about at night as a problem. So the third category of space weapons, so to speak, are weapons that might be based in space, but they're aiming at targets on the ground. Okay, so the most famous example of this is the so-called rods from God, which envisions a very large space platform equipped with numerous titanium rods that would be launched out of this platform to the Earth. And because of their speed, the impact would be like a bomb. Again, we're verging into the territory of science fiction there. There have been plenty of PowerPoints since the 1990s or so on this kind of system. They've never figured out how to actually really make it work. It's not that it violates the laws of physics per se, but it violates the sort of limits of engineering, if you will. So the only thing that we're really faced with today, we're faced with the possibility of ASATs, as I said. They've already been tested. We're faced with the possibility of the use of jammers, electromagnetic jamming, which can be done from the ground as well as from space. It has happened in previous conflicts. And lastly, we're talking about the potential for the use of lasers based on the ground to do damage to satellites that are trying to see something, so to the optical systems of satellites. Those are the three things that are in the realm of the possible at the moment.
Just to talk a little bit about the physics of space, when you've got two satellites approaching each other, if you make an analogy of two cars driving down a big road in any major city, what's the difference between two things crashing into each other on the ground and two things crashing into each other in space?
Speed, the speed of the collision. Things that are orbiting around the Earth move very, very fast. It's 7.5 kilometers per second in low Earth orbit. It's slightly different in high Earth orbit. But anyway, that's the common speed that's cited for two satellites traveling in orbit. And if those two things slam into each other, you can imagine the energy impact. A piece of debris, a piece of space junk the size of my thumbnail can kill a working satellite, if it hits it in the right spot. Okay. Remember I mentioned space junk? Because if you have 20,000 pieces of space debris, space junk, that we can see, which means it has to be bigger than a baseball for us to see it, if any one of those things that size hits a satellite, it is going to do major damage. An even worse problem? There are probably millions of pieces of debris that we can't see. There's a famous story about space debris that when Sally Ride, the first female astronaut, went up in the space shuttle and returned from her mission, they did a checkout on the shuttle. They always they take a look at it to make sure everything's cool, nothing was harmed, all the parts are working, and they found a crack in the windshield. So sort of like if a piece of gravel flew up on your car and makes that little spider web kind of crack, they found a little crack in the windshield. They determined that crack on the space shuttle windshield was made by a 4-millimeter fleck of paint.
But does space junk, as you call it, apply to all satellites? Is this in specific areas of space? Can we move around it? Or does it apply, is it something which is a problem for all space actors or just some of us?
It's a problem for everyone. Space junk knows no nationality. It also doesn't know whether your satellite is a military satellite or a civilian satellite. Some areas of outer space are more polluted than other areas, sort of like on the Earth. Some areas of the Earth are more polluted, or some areas of the ocean are more polluted. And that's a factor that's attributed to the fact that every time you go into space, you create space junk. You cannot not create space junk. You will create some junk when you put something in orbit. So those orbits that are used heavily, like the low Earth orbit for imaging satellites, for those that take pictures, are quite polluted because there's a lot of satellites there. So there's a lot of space junk there. There have been a lot of flights there. Another orbit that's really highly polluted is the so-called geosynchronous orbit, which is 36,000 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, where a satellite seems to be still over the Earth. So instead of it stays over the same location on the ground, essentially. And this is where most of the broadcast television satellites, communication satellites are, so that their operators only have to build one communications tower. They don't have to build 1,000 all around the Earth as the satellite orbits over. So that's a very, very crowded orbit. And it's also a very, very polluted orbit. So we have a problem that we continue to make space junk, and we don't really know how to get rid of it. So that's a problem. Yes, you can maneuver around objects. Satellites have some capability to maneuver, not a lot. It's not, again, like Star Wars. You can't take a satellite and zip it halfway across the world in 2 seconds. No, that doesn't work. It's much more complicated than that. But you can move a satellite to get it out of the way of another satellite or a large object. But you have to see the object, and you have to have good warning time that this is about to happen. And the systems that are available for that around the world are not actually really up to speed.
So as you said, there are over 60 countries now which are now involved in space activities. This seems to be something that the international community must be getting more and more concerned about. And if they're not, it certainly seems from what you're saying they should be. Perhaps you can talk just a little bit about what's happened in the international community. One of the terms we've heard a few times is the term PAROS, Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. What has the international community been doing to work on space security issues? And the other term we've heard a lot about is space sustainability. Is that the same thing, or is that a little different?
Okay. The international community has been worried about the question of warfare in space, again, almost since the dawn of the space age. And that concern led in 1967 to the adoption of the Outer Space Treaty, which is kind of like a framework agreement. It establishes space as a global commons. That is, it doesn't belong to anyone. There's no national sovereignty. It does, as I mentioned before, prevent the placement of weapons of mass destruction in space or on celestial bodies. But it's not a specific treaty in a lot of ways. It's again a framework, kind of a charter, if you will, for the use of outer space. But the reason that was passed in 1967 was the fear by many countries that the Soviet Union and the United States would take their nuclear arms race to space. And that was considered a global risk. Since then, there have been several other treaties that have been passed on space. Well, probably the most important one is the so-called Liability Convention, which says that if your satellite or your rocket launch does harm to somebody else's stuff, whether it's stuff in space or stuff on the ground, then you are responsible. In the old days, as I said, there were only 2 powers, and then there were 3. At the dawn of the commercial space industry many years ago now, there were only 2 or 3 big companies. It's only been in the last 15 maybe years that there's been this real explosion of activity in space. There's been a lot of activity really probably since the 1980s on 2 things. One is trying to deal with the problem of the potential for an arms race in outer space. So when you say PAROS stands for the Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. And the international community has been working, or trying, to work on that since the 80s in the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. Unfortunately, those discussions have not gone very far. The Conference on Disarmament itself has been blocked for the past 15 years, not over the space issue, over other issues, but the fact that the CD is the body that would be responsible for discussing this issue has created a problem or a stalemate. There's been very little movement on the issue of prevention of an arms race in outer space. And that's partly CD problems is partly political because major players haven't agreed on the need to do that. And so that's been an issue. The other place where space issues are dealt with in the international community is the Committee for Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in Vienna. And they are responsible for looking at scientific and technical issues with regards to peaceful use of outer space, as well as legal issues. Whereas the Scientific and Technical Committee has made some progress on dealing with issues like space debris. The UN a couple years ago passed voluntary guidelines on trying to mitigate space debris, which means using best practices to create as little space junk as possible when you send something into orbit, okay? So those guidelines came out of the committee, the COPUS, it's called the COPUS, and the scientific and technical community, which was a big success. It was a really major step forward in protecting the space environment. Since the debris guidelines were passed, there has been a good deal of discussion at the COPUS on what to do next. And in 2010, the COPUS agreed to a new agenda item on long-term sustainability of space, which essentially is looking at what we as an international community have to do to make sure that space doesn't become polluted, overly congested, that you start having collisions between satellites, that there are some rules and regulations for how you operate in space. This is something that is increasingly a problem as you have more and more actors. If you think about the parallel with aviation, civil aviation, in the beginning of civil aviation, there's, again, 2 or 3 countries that were flying passengers back and forth across the Atlantic, primarily. And as more and more nations got aircraft, civil aircraft, and wanted to be able to own their own planes and to fly people, to make money, business model, et cetera, but also just to be able to take passengers back and forth from their country, things started to get really crowded in the skies. And there wasn't any system for managing who gets to fly first, who gets to land. How do you make sure that 2 planes that are over the Atlantic Ocean don't run into each other? So something was created called the International Civil Aviation Organization. And essentially, that's it's what it sounds like. It's an international agency that regulates the traffic flow of airplanes. And it also makes sure that, people can speak the same languages, that there are guidelines for how you land your plane. There are standards for safety. This gradually evolved over time because there was a need. We're at the place where we can no longer do this informally. We have to have some regulations, some guidelines, some mutually agreed space traffic laws, if you will.
So that sounds like that would solve many of our problems with the efforts of the Committee for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. In the aircraft domain, you have military aircraft and non-military aircraft, and they all have to abide by the same rules or they crash into each other. What's the difference with the space sector in terms of disarmament, weaponization? Do we need different regulations, agreements, treaties that are different from the kind of work that the COPUOS is doing?
That's a good question. I mean, you are correct that sort of safety rules, traffic management rules, would have to affect both civil and military satellites or commercial. Some people break the satellites down into 3 types: civil satellites, which are owned by governments, commercial satellites that are owned by companies, and military satellites that are owned by military. So obviously, you would have to have military satellites included. I should note that military satellites make up a very small population of the satellites on orbit. Most militaries use satellites that provide civil and military services. So that's just an aside. There aren't a lot of dedicated military satellites, although many militaries use satellites. In some ways, yes, if the COPUS continues, if they make some good rules, these things will, I think, help create transparency, which means people know what other people are doing, so they're less suspicious. It will help ensure good practices, which is also important. However, space traffic management regulations are not going to solve the problem of people perhaps shooting down satellites or wanting to put weapons in space or base weapons in space, et cetera. So that part of it is going to have to be addressed in a different manner. Now, it may need to be addressed in a legally binding treaty eventually, but one of the things that I think personally, and I there has been a consensus on this in the international community, could happen first is the creation of transparency and confidence building measures. And indeed, the UN last year agreed to create something called a group of governmental experts on transparency and confidence building measures for outer space activities. And essentially, this group is going to get together next year through 2013 to try to say, are there things that we can do on a voluntary basis that will help prevent conflict in space and will dampen the risks of weaponization of space? Okay. The idea of transparency and confidence building measures is not new. It's been used in every other domain. It's been used in questions, for example, of use of the sea. There are several actual treaties, like the Law of the Sea. The Law of the Sea Treaty is one, which regulate behavior on the high seas, military behavior on the high seas, so there aren't accidental conflicts or there's not tensions. For example, if you're going to run a naval exercise, you have to tell people. You don't want to provoke an incident. So there are other forms of transparency and confidence building measures that have been used to try to prevent conflicts, to ensure against accidental conflict in particular, and to raise the level of trust. When you say confidence building, you're talking about raising the level of trust, so not having so many suspicions. So this is what the group of governmental experts is supposed to work on, trying to develop some TCBMs or some ideas for TCBMs or some ideas of how to go forward with building out TCBMs. It may sound simple because you can think probably pretty easily off the top of your head, well, first thing people need to do is they need to talk to each other. They need to exchange information. They need to exchange data about where their satellites are, etc. And yes, you can pretty easily select these macro categories where it would help matters. Exchange space policies, have military-to-military conversations. These are not novel or new ideas. It's not rocket science, TCBMs. So the problem, however, is that the devil is in the details. So what level of data do you need to exchange for this to be useful? So there's probably going to be a lot of talk and a very long process to be able to reach some voluntary, agreed transparency and confidence building measures. But it's going to be a start next year in July, and that's really a good thing. It's not the end point, but it's a start point, and it's the first time we've had a start point in a very long time.
So talking about trust and levels of understanding, how much do we really know about what's going on in the space environment? How much data do we have on a day-to-day basis of the activities, and how does that impact on concerns and potential paranoia and the general stability of the global scenario related to space?
Different nation states have different capabilities to monitor what goes on in space. The United States has arguably the best network of sensors to see, if you will, what's happening in space. In order to watch the skies, monitor the skies, you need radars and you need telescopes and you need a highly complicated computer system to be able to crunch all of that data. And it's expensive, it's difficult, and your level of precision, even in the U.S., which has the best system, is not all that great because of the limits of the technologies themselves. The U.S. has the best system. The Russians have a system as well. China has some capabilities, and the EU has some smaller amounts of capabilities, although they're trying to build their capabilities. But it's not enough. Oh, I should have mentioned that Japan also has some pretty good capabilities. But the problem is that the only nation that shares this data on a regular basis is the U.S. However, the U.S. doesn't share all the data it has because the data is collected by the U.S. military for military reasons. It's not collected for civil reasons, okay, which leads to concerns about secrecy and et cetera, et cetera. And all the other nations, they do not share the data with the big wide world, okay? On occasion, there have been bilateral sharing of data when one country sees that there might be a problem with another country. Or, for example, when the Chinese taikonauts went up, the U.S. went out of its way to give them data about where there might be debris so that the Chinese space capsule didn't run into something and explode. So that was good. But there's not a system for sharing the data. There's not good enough technology right now to be able to provide data at a clarity level that would be required to prevent collisions, etc. There's a lot of mistrust. And so while some nations publish space policies and space doctrines, other nations do not. While some nations publish their space budgets, other nations do not. Some nations publish some things but hide other things, and so that creates suspicions about what's not being said. So there's a lot of mistrust amongst nations about what they're doing technologically and what they intend to do with technology in space. And so that's a real problem. There's not a lot of information exchange there either.
So that sounds a little bit scary. Not that we're going into an environment where we don't know too much about. So let's talk a little bit about what space warfare might look like. When this is often articulated, people again imagine two Death Stars squaring off against each other in space. But would a space conflict really look like that, or would space be part of a greater conflict?
Yeah, I think when you talk about conflict in space, you can't talk about it in a vacuum. That it's unlikely that someone is just simply going to, out of the blue, blow up somebody's satellite. That's not going to happen. And I can't imagine a conflict that solely happens in space, that only involves satellites or space shuttle-like vehicles or whatever. That doesn't make any sense, really. Space will be used, or could be used, as both a domain of warfare. In other words, things are being done in space to satellites during the course of a conflict. So just as if you would have fighter planes fighting it out in the air, you might have ships, battleships battling at sea. You can have tanks, So it would just be another place where warfare was being undertaken, okay? That said, the problem with fighting in space or warfare in space is that you run two very great risks. The first is if you are using the easiest kind of weapons to destroy satellites, which are the anti-satellite weapons based on the Earth or on the ground or on the sea, these types of weapons create space debris. And space debris, again, knows no nationality, and it is uncontrolled. So that kind of weapon creates a danger for everyone's satellites, not just the satellites of the combatants. So that's a big problem. What I think we are worried about is the fact that not only do you have this potential for debris, you also have the potential to escalate a conflict. So if you have two spacefaring powers who use some kind of technology to take out the other side's satellite, how does the other side react? Well, if they're a nuclear power, they may think about using their nuclear weapons. Because why? Because if someone's taken out your ability to see what they're doing, your suspicion is going to be that they are escalating as much as they can escalate. In other words, you have to think worst case. So you can imagine I can imagine a situation where no one even wanted to go to war, and you end up with nuclear war. How do you do that? You've got a crisis between two countries who are always on the verge of conflict. So you have two enemies, essentially, of opposing sides. And a crisis is starting to heat up between the two of them. And all of a sudden, one side's satellites go dark, or one of their major satellites go dark that they use to monitor the other country. And both sides know that both sides have space weapons. The side whose satellite goes dark, what are they going to think? They're going to think that's the launch of an attack. But you know what? It might have been a piece of space debris. It might have been a solar flare. It's actually quite hard to know what's happened to your satellite because you just can't send up the repairman and take a look. But in the heat of a crisis, what's going to be your first thought? So there's a whole lot of problems here, not just the question of environmental pollution or debris, but also the problems of crisis escalation when these kinds of weapons might be used.
So it sounds like transparency and confidence-building measures are a really essential part of the work of the international community.
They are, and I should have said this earlier, but you mentioned the whole thing about U.S. and Russia. You know, the Cold War lasted a long time, and the two sides had lots of incentive not to nuke each other. And yet they were in competition, often in military competition, often in proxy wars. Lots of things went on in the Cold War. But the Soviet Union and the United States also had processes. They understood how each other's decision-making chains went. There was such a thing as the hotline developed so the two presidents could talk in case of a crisis. And therefore, there were ways of de-escalating when things heated up. There were known processes for ratcheting the heat back down. In today's world, when you have so many actors, including actors who are enemies, including more actors who are nuclear weapon states, you don't have those processes. There aren't processes for de-escalating in a conflict. And that is really extremely problematic, and it's something that transparency and confidence-building measures could address. At least if you have processes for dialogue and for discussion and you know who to call on the other side of the world, you could de-escalate in a conflict, and that could be really critically important as a first step.
So you've mentioned very many different ways that satellite services could be affected. Let's talk a little bit about what that looks like in a conflict environment. What is offensive action in space? If you jam a satellite, is that an act of war? If you blow up a satellite, is that an act of war? In the conventional side, this has been pretty well established. Where do we stand with that in the space environment?
Well, I think that, again, that depends on which space lawyer you probably ask. You would really have to think about a case-by-case basis here. Satellites have been jammed. Satellites have been jammed in peacetime, and people haven't gone to war. If, on the other hand, there was a conflict that was beginning in the early stages and someone took a first shot by taking out someone's satellite, I would assume that would trigger a full-blown war. I can't imagine that it wouldn't. If it were on the cusp of a crisis. Again, if someone is messing around with somebody's satellite in peacetime, I'm not necessarily sure that would also be grounds for war. In other words, if I target your satellite with means less than destruction is what I'm trying to say, I think whether or not that's a cause for war would be case specific.
So, Theresa, it sounds like you, your institute, and the international community have many things to work on in this field. If you had one takeaway on space security you could tell our listeners today, what would that be?
What any one actor in space does can affect all other actors, whether that be positive or negative. There is no solution to the problems of space, whether they be the environmental problems or whether they be the potential for conflict, the use of weapons, that can be resolved unilaterally. Everyone has to be involved. Space is everyone's business. And it's not just the 60 countries that are currently using satellites directly or own or operate satellites. Every single nation in the world, every single person in the world needs space to be peaceful and usable and sustainable over the long term. And we have to work at this together.
Many thanks, Theresa. This has been a most interesting interview. This programme has been produced for the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs with technical support from the United Nations Department of Public Information. Many thanks to our audio engineer, Rosie Starr. We would like to make it clear that the opinions on this programme are those of the interviewee and do not necessarily represent those of the United Nations. This is Ben Walker of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Many thanks.